On behalf of the city of Knoxville, all of our staff, our council members, and our partners, I want to thank you. I want to thank AARP for recognizing and welcoming us into this network of age-friendly communities. There are many of us who are excited about this. Our partners at Active Knox, MPC, TPO, Knoxville Area Transit, and all of the community advocates who support our goal of creating an age-friendly community. I'm looking forward to seeing your presentation, Jana, on what makes a community livable. I saw it this morning. I saw it at the TPO, and I understand you're expanding even more for this one, so I'm looking forward to seeing that. We know that being age-friendly, that is being a great place for people of all ages, is key to being a livable community. We also know that being designated a member of the AARP network of age-friendly communities doesn't mean that we've actually reached the goal, that we fully achieved the status. We acknowledged this last night at our city council meeting when the local volunteer leader, Mitch Olszewski, congratulated us as well on being an age-friendly city. The designation doesn't mean that Knoxville is already the perfect model for a city where you can grow old in place. Not yet anyway. Likewise, it doesn't automatically mean that this is a great place to retire, although that may well that may be the case. We could argue that that is the case in Knoxville. As an aside, just last week, CNBC reported an analysis by Smart Asset that said that we made the top 10 list of U.S. cities with an affordable cost of living for retirees. And the news coverage showed this great photo of people enjoying Market Square on a sunny day. So it was a really nice write-up, so check it out if you missed it. So here's what being an AARP age-friendly community means. It recognizes the commitment by the local elected leadership, our council here included, to make their city or county a great place to live for people of all ages. The planners and the policymakers, of which there are many here today, know that's exactly what we're aiming to do. I appreciate the unwavering and enthusiastic support of City Council for our efforts to make Knoxville age-friendly. And Finbar's already recognized who's here today, but I want to give a special shout out and thank you to George Wallace, Marshall Stair, Seema Singh Prez, and Finbar Saunders for their leadership. I recognize a few people on the city team who are real leaders in our efforts to become a more inclusive, welcoming, and age-friendly city. Of course, Bill Lyons, who's my deputy to the mayor and chief policy officer, Dawn Michelle Foster, our director of redevelopment, and last but certainly not least, our star, Stephanie Cook, our ADA coordinator, who's head of the City Disability Services Office, and our #1 advocate who thinks really 24/7 about ways to improve accessibility and age friendliness. So thank you to you and all the rest of our staff back at the office who make this possible. The goal to be age friendly drives our budgets and our programs. For example, we invest in infrastructure that promotes walkability and transit. We fund and help leverage other funds to renovate and to build new housing that is both energy efficient and affordable and accessible. We are expanding access to public transit services and improving the frequency and convenience of those services. And we're creating fully accessible outdoor spaces. And Suttree Landing Park, who's been to Suttree Landing Park, it's really a wonderful example of an accessible outdoor space. And we're doubling down on that investment in the coming year by adding a pavilion with restrooms and an accessible kayak launch. So in short, we envision a city that can be home to everyone, from families with children to active outdoor adventurers to people with disabilities and to senior citizens. Being a part of AARP's age-friendly network means that our city will continue to make aging issues a priority in our policies and actions. And it's not just because I got my Medicare. And a commitment to providing more safety and security. And that dovetails with improving resources that enhance personal independence and health and creating more opportunities for older individuals to remain more connected to their neighborhoods. Knoxville is so pleased to join Kingsport, Chattanooga, and Memphis as AARP age-friendly cities in Tennessee, and we join with 212 member communities across the country that represent more than 61 million people. Thanks so much.
Congratulations, Mayor. So it is a thrill for me to be here in Knoxville and to visit with you all. This is my first trip to Tennessee, so I am very pleased by the level of livability and just beauty of this part of the country as well as the city itself. And I think you all have a fabulous foundation for becoming more age-friendly, livable over time. So that is really the set of remarks that I have here today is focused on these topics. AARP, with our 38 million members, we're probably better known for our work on securing health care and financial security, working at the federal level and at the state and state legislatures. But increasingly, we're showing up locally to really demand that our communities are designed in service so that we can really emphasize the health and well-being of people across the age spectrum. And one of the ways we do that is through our Livable Communities program and Age-Friendly Communities Network. Okay. This work is more important than ever. I think we all realize that our nation is aging, but I like to show these images just to hit home the point how dramatic the demographic shift is in the United States. This slide shows the population age 65 and older in the United States at the last census, 2010, and you can see this way. That in just 10 years, the nation has certainly become older, and in another 10 years, we can see that I think Tennessee went from the second lightest shade of 12 to 15% of the population 65 and older to now 18 to 21% of the population. That's a shift that's really occurring across the country in every community in the United States. And it's also, think of it not as a pig in the python. We're not getting to this point and boomers age out and things get back to normal. This is a permanent shift in the demographic makeup of the United States in our communities. And that's because of increased longevity and because of lower birth rates. So my generation, Gen X, while we're somewhat smaller than the boomer generation, the millennial generation after us is another large generation. And these different factors come together to really reestablish our demographic composition. The other piece of this is represented in this slide, which shows the composition of the population 50 and older by race and ethnicity. And you can see the bottom blue foundational bars. Those represent the white population in America, and that population has now pretty much stabilized. And the growth in the population 50 and older is going to be among the non-white people of color. So again, a much more diverse country. Now, this demographic shift is both a challenge, but it's also an incredible opportunity. And I think combined with our state of health, it's absolutely imperative that we think about how we plan, design, and build our communities in much different ways. It's really an opportunity because when we get it right, people across the age spectrum are able to engage in the economic, social, civic life of their communities in much more, in much higher levels and degrees. So I want to just run through very quickly, what is it we mean by livability? Because it's really multifaceted. So very quickly, we're talking about housing, both in the sense of housing affordability as well as accessibility. Can families of different incomes find appropriate housing for their income levels? Can folks who are using wheelchairs or otherwise have difficulty navigating stairs Are there homes in the community that are accessible to them at those different price points? Less than 3% of our housing stock in the United States is accessible today. And I think one of the reasons that Knoxville scores fairly high on housing in the Livability Index, which I'll talk about in a moment, is because you have more than twice the housing stock in accessible housing than the median neighborhood or community in the United States. So kudos, done some important things there. Neighborhoods. We're looking for safe and vibrant neighborhoods. And this here, we're really talking about those, what planners call the live, work, play, worship, learn type of neighborhoods that are very vibrant, that have enough density that it really brings people together. There's enough mix of different uses so that people come out onto the street and there are those chance encounters. There are also neighborhoods where you don't have to rely 100% on your personal automobile. There's transportation options in the community, and it's convenient to get to some of the basic services on foot. On transportation, which of course is very much related to land use, but it's making sure that we provide options for how people in the community get around. One of the little known facts, I think, in the United States is that a third of our country doesn't drive. That includes 1 in every 5 individuals over the age of 65. It includes many people with disabilities, many low-income people who can't afford the upkeep of a personal vehicle, as well as children who are not yet licensed. So when you add that together, many folks are challenged by the lack of transportation options in their community. And it never ceases to astound me that even though a third of our population are non-drivers, we basically tell our citizens that if you don't have your own wheels, you're not going to have full access to the economic and social life of your community. Clean air and water, as well as the preparedness that a community puts forth to make sure that they're able to respond effectively to natural and human-induced disasters. Someone is better at this if you come to my slides. To quality health care, as well as opportunities to prevent getting ill in the first place. So exercise opportunities in the community are extremely important. Engagement, civic and social engagement. We at the Public Policy Institute just released a paper that documents the cost of social isolation to the Medicare population alone. It's $6.7 billion annually. Now, if we were to take that amount of money, combine it with the $30 billion annually in the cost of older adults who fall, half of whom fall in their home, the other half in the public right-of-way, we can all of a sudden find a tremendous amount of money that if we put it back into the design of our communities and the servicing of our communities, we can make some really big changes. Unfortunately, these types of decisions are very siloed still in, I think, decision-making at all levels of government, and that's one of the things that, hopefully, with the age-friendly communities, some of that coordination can happen. Opportunity is really measurements for both educational and economic opportunities in the community that really extends across all various population groups to make sure that people not only get a good quality education, but there are those jobs where they find meaningful work in their lives and even continuing education in retirement. Ellen, would you be willing to help me flip my
There's a pillar that likes to get in the way.
Okay.
So I can do you want me to take that and just
give me a heads up? I think I need to go back one, actually.
Okay, get closer.
So, livable communities, this it has tremendous benefits across the board. This slide from Active Living Research kind of summarizes some of those benefits in terms of health. And you can see people who live in livable neighborhoods are 2 times as likely to get enough physical activity as those who do not live in walkable neighborhoods. The number of children who are physically active outside is 84% higher when schoolyards are kept open for public use after hours. Teens who live in poor or mostly minority neighborhoods are 50% less likely to have a recreational facility near home. So we've got some deep-seated equity issues and decisions in our community to be made. People who live near trails are 50% more likely to meet physical activity guidelines. And these benefits really extend for the older population in communities as well. This slide summarizes a literature reviewed by the Population Health Bureau, I think that's the name of it, in a federal organization. Anyway, they've documented the various research on the connection between the built environment and health among people 65 and older. And some of the big ahas from this research that we're seeing time and again in these evidence-based studies is that when you build these walkable communities that have this level of connectivity, it really starts to impact the amount that older adults in the communities walk, get that needed exercise, get out and about. Compact communities, where there's that diverse mix of uses. We found interesting, I like to point out the longer walks by older men, and I'm not quite sure why that is, but I hypothesize that men have purpose and they need to walk to something, not just go on recreational walks. And destinations built within a neighborhood is really important. And in terms of what can help our cognitive stamina and outcomes as we age, now there's good research that shows both air quality has an impact on that, as well as the opportunity to visit libraries, parks, various public spaces, that these things actually do matter in terms of health. And that translates down to the bottom line in health expenditures within the community. And just to that point, livable communities are economically viable communities. There's a number of different studies out there that show the economic value of investing in things like sidewalks and walkable communities. So for instance, in one study they found in Philadelphia, homes close to parks and open spaces have higher property, 33% higher property values than those further away from parks and open spaces. In Elizabeth, New Jersey, 64% higher property values. Oakland, California, 145% higher. And how many are familiar with WalkScore? Fair number. WalkScore is an online tool. It's used by Zillow, other real estate online companies that you look up potential housing buys and, for various purposes. Anyway, there's been a number of academic studies that have found that the walkability of a neighborhood increases those property values. So WalkScore of 1 point increase can improve the value of a home by as much as $3,000. And some of those academic studies, they also found that the closer you are to a downtown area or another mixed-use development area, the higher the return on that WalkScore, et cetera. So back to the AARP Network of Age-Friendly Communities. This is a map of our participating communities as of February. We need to update that. There are now 4 communities here in Tennessee that have become members. And I I think the mayor gave a really nice overview of what the program aims to achieve. It's really not about that certification that you're the best, but it's that recognition that you're going to do that hard work to become more livable, age-friendly over time, and that work is so important. It's a very locally driven process, so the community gets together and it defines what its needs are. It defines what those action steps, those priority steps that need to be taken. I think the real value of the network is that you are networked with a community of others like yourselves around the United States and even around the world to share lessons learned and get good information. The other aspect that we hope will happen is we know that most communities are already working on some aspects of livability in their current planning processes and other decision-making processes. What this we hope to achieve here is that those processes are not done in silos. So too often in communities, we're planning for children over here, we're planning for middle-aged commuters in the center, and we're planning for older adults over there at the Area Agency on Aging. And what we need to do is bring these conversations and planning exercises together so we see where those synergies are and where we can really make investments that benefit the community at large. Now, this is the home screen to our Livability Index. This is a tool developed by my team at the Public Policy Institute. And how many of you have used the Livability Index, have played around in this? Very few. Oh, good. So just a brief overview. We released the first version of the index back in April of 2015. It's the first online tool that allows you to type in an address and return a score for every neighborhood and community in the United States against 60 indicators of livability. You have other indices like Walk Score that's looking at one or a couple of aspects of livability, but what we've tried to do is say livability is about this broad range of topics. They all intersect and they're all important to work and need to work together. So that's what we hope to do, as opposed to simply continuing to dish out lots of publications and research that only the most devoted planners would actually read, like Ellen, I'm sure. That we put a tool in the hands of folks and we design it in a way that it's easy to use to someone who doesn't have a planning degree, but you have access to lots of really hardcore data. It's a great snapshot to present to your community to start looking at where are our strengths, where are some of our weaknesses. So let's move to the first slide. So once you've input an address, I will say right here, this is the results page for the city of Knoxville. And if you enter an address, it's going to return a score for that neighborhood. It's defined by the census block group around that address. But if you enter a city name like Knoxville, that's the average of all the neighborhood scores within the city boundaries. So it is sensitive to the level of geography, and you can see those types of differences. I realize, go back one slide, let me explain it. It's very difficult to see on this map, but these are, again, our 7 categories of livability. Knoxville's scoring quite high in the area of housing right now. Again, that's largely due overall to the general housing affordability relative to the rest of the United States, and this higher percentage of both multifamily housing and accessible housing. So the score of 52, just to give a little explanation, that's on a scale of 0 to 100, with 50 being the midpoint. We're basically comparing your location to every other place in the United States, and 50 being the midpoint, the average. 52, while it doesn't seem that high if you're getting graded in school, it's actually not a bad score. Our highest scoring city for mid-sized cities scores a 68, and that is La Crosse, Wisconsin. Then I hope and the number 10 mid-sized city is Cambridge, Massachusetts, with 63. So while there's certainly room for improvement, I think don't be totally turned off by a score of 52. It's really it's above average. So let's just one more mention that all of our categories of livability have equal weight within the index. And then if you're curious to know, how do we measure any particular one, you can click on any of these categories, open it up, and see the list of indicators that we use to provide a score for that category of livability. We have both quantitative metrics, so we calculate a score on the metrics. Each metric has about equal weight. And then we give the community policy points for every policy that you have in place that we feel will help you become more livable over time. So for instance, on housing, you're getting a score for your visitability ordinance, for Housing Trust Fund, and then there's a state level housing policy to help prevent foreclosures. And so additional 3 policy points right there. Let's go to the next slide. The Livable allows you to line up 3 communities side by side to make a comparison. I've lined up Knoxville, Knox County, and Chattanooga. And while the total scores are very similar, you can start to see when you look at the different categories of livability, there's more variation. And it's by looking at that, zeroing down that you can start to really understand what's going on in your community relative to other places.
Can we protest those?
All the time.
Or add additional information. There's no way that Chattanooga beats us on Civic.
I wish we could do a live demo because I can answer these questions very easily.
We'll follow up on that one.
Is it possible Chattanooga's voting rates are higher than yours? I
hope they are. Because ours are still pretty low.
I remember when I looked at it earlier, I felt like, the voting rates here are bringing things down. In terms of civic engagement, though, the one measure we have within the Livability Index, we're pulling from the national, I forget the government agency, but it's a federal agency that does an annual national survey every couple of years on volunteer rates, on how often you speak with your neighbor, how often you help your neighbor, and we built a little index from that survey that measures it. Now, the unfortunate thing with that data is there's only a sample size large enough for the 51 largest metro areas, so all other areas we're applying a state score, so I think you're across the board getting the same engagement score on that category. Why don't we go to the next slide? And if I was asked this question after the public presentation last night. So if you were to give us a hint at how would we be the top scoring communities in the future, in a future livability index, what would you recommend we focus on? And I would say my 2 big takeaways is look at the neighborhood livability, these proximity measures, and look at transportation. So this here is the neighborhood and how the performance does. And so we're measuring what's walkable from the center of each neighborhood in terms of parks, grocery stores, farmers markets, libraries. It's not whether you have these in your community, it's whether someone who lives in that neighborhood can actually walk to access those services. So there's a lot of communities in terms of protesting the results of the index. They'll say, whoa, you got it all wrong. We have grocery stores, because sometimes there's 0 up there. And we'll say, well, yes, but if you've located all your grocery stores on the outskirts of town and they are only accessible to one neighborhood, you're not scoring very high in the livability index. And that's how we encourage and penalize communities through this. This here will change the next index, this red. The colored dots, green is that you're performing in the top third of the country, yellow in the middle third, and red in the bottom third. It just so happens that when we pulled the data for this version of the index, CATS had not yet reported its route and schedule data to the national database that we pull from. I do see in the updated data, which we were going to release in June, that you will be credited for your very good transit service, I mean award-winning transit service here in Knoxville. Then again, looking at what I talked about before, that mix and intensity of use, we have these surrogate indicators of the diversity of industries and job categories within the community, as well as the activity density, the concentration of population and jobs within a defined area. So in all of these, you're kind of in the midpoint, so there's definitely room for improvement in the neighborhood category of livability. And just looking around the community, when I walk around downtown and when I hear what was presented at the TPO, I think that those foundations for livability are certainly in place. There's a good, I think, understanding from the professional staff of how to get there if this is the direction that the community wants to go. Transportation, we're measuring, no, this is still neighborhood. This is transportation. This is a little larger just for the city of Knoxville, but I think Knox County shows some similar patterns. Again, ignore the top line, frequency of public transit, because we don't have your data yet. We do know that of the buses you have, 94% are accessible. People with wheelchairs can get on and off. That's a good thing. You see you're in the top third of the country. It's kind of in the mid-range. Congestion, again, mid-range. And then household transportation costs, not bad. And finally, what really jumped out to me as a transportation planner and someone who promotes complete streets, which are streets that are designed for all users and really looking at the safety of the streets. Relative to other parts of the country, you have very fast streets. That's not uncommon to the South. Going up in your fatality rates, your road fatality rates. So there's a real correlation there. I think it also can show up under environment and the level of traffic and noise that are close to residences as well. So moving on from where we are today to where we might like to get to. And I would encourage the community, and you've probably already done this, don't start with conversations with citizens about density, even though I mentioned it here today. Yes, you need density to make some of this stuff happen, but that's not what it's about. It's really about envisioning what is possible and how it can be differently designed to really make it work. So AARP has done active living workshops around the country with the Walk Institute, and this is an example from Orange Beach, Alabama, of what the community and their designer envisioned with the community for a refurbishment of this kind of ubiquitous strip mall development that is very common across the United States. So this is it today, and slowly you can see how by building just enough density to help define that street, it creates a sense of place and destination, and it really encourages people to come out. This I can't emphasize enough, as if you look at the trends for shopping, retail sales, 50% of our retail sales are now online as a nation. If you're going to be buying anything in bricks and mortar, consumers are looking for an experience. They're probably not desiring an experience of suburbia and traffic just to pick up a gallon of milk, or whatever that errand is. But they will be looking, when they want to go get a cup of coffee, Might there be an opportunity to bump into friends or colleagues or, you know, folks we know? Might there be the opportunity to get some other things accomplished in the same space? So the design and pulling all of this stuff together can really make a huge difference. I also just want to just want to offer some examples from other parts of the country. This is Arlington, Virginia, where I live today, where I've served on the Transportation Commission for 6 years. And Arlington is well known in planning circles as being one of those live, work, play types of communities with lots of people-centered, transit-oriented development. And what that is when Metro was going in, back in planning in the 60s, building it out in the 70s, Arlington made a commitment to focusing its development around those transit stations. And 40 years later, they've really, it's been an economic boom for the community. So you can see examples that this is kind of design works not only for young professionals, but the design also works for older adults in the community. Before I came to AARP, I worked for a regional transit planning organization and did a study on senior travel patterns and how they varied by the type of community in which they lived. And we interviewed over 1,600 residents aged 75 and older across Northern Virginia. We divided the results by the kind of community they lived in, whether it was one of these transit-oriented, walkable, mixed-use developments or a downtown, historic downtowns in Northern Virginia versus suburban or even what we would call exurban, the further out, less dense than suburban even. And we found even among older adults, 75 and older, that first they took 20% more trips every week than their suburban counterparts, which is super important. It gets back to that social isolation issue and how do we overcome that. They were twice as likely than suburban older adults to use public transportation, but most striking, 22%, nearly a quarter of all of their trips were on foot. Because the way Arlington designed the communities, they could walk to the library, the grocery store, the mall, the parks, just the bank, restaurants, a variety of services. And it really has benefited those who are fortunate enough to live along one of these rail corridors. And there's both, Arlington has both subsidized senior housing near the stations as well as market rate retirement communities. Very good. Also, this is just a photograph from one of those nodes, transit villages in Clarendon. And from the county's transportation studies, they found that of residents who live in this corridor, only 39% of their trips are taken in a private automobile. The rest of their trips are on transit, walking, biking, etc. So you compare 39% to 83%, the national average, and you begin to see that this type of land use and transportation can really profoundly change how people choose to get around.
Is that Silver Line?
It connects to the Silver Line. It's the orange line through Arlington. The other thing to mention is, like I said, Arlington put its economic development basket into these nodes, these transit villages, and now the assessed value, they basically, the tax generation from the assessed value of 11% of the land area, they're making like 90% of their return on investment there. Next slide. This is an example that you can really scale this type of development and design to different contexts. So I've mentioned Arlington, it's a very urban context, but scale it down. Now Cleveland, this is Cleveland's Health Line. It's also an urban context. However, they're serving this with bus rapid transit. And this can be a very sensible investment, particularly in this environment where there's such an incredible amount of disruption and emerging disruption from new technologies. Uber, Lyft, on-demand transportation, even looking down the road at autonomous vehicles. So the Helpline, which went in a few years ago, it's a 7-mile corridor. It connects downtown with university, with hospitals, Cleveland Clinic, and they invested $200 million in public infrastructure dollars, most of that in federal funds. They have seen almost $6 billion in real estate development along the half-mile of that corridor. They've also, because of the street, when they did the design for the bus, they also put in bike lanes and improved the sidewalks, so they've seen an increase in bicycling and walking along that corridor as well. This is an example from Denver, Colorado. Just want to point out that the private sector can make money off of building affordable housing. This development here is just right outside of one of the new fast-track systems. And the way they package this up, they're getting federal low-income housing tax credits, other resources from the community. But one of the neat partnerships was with the Urban Land Conservancy, which basically a land trust, which I understand you have here in this area. And Urban Land Conservancy, when they were planning the fast-track system, they went in and started buying property for those planned station areas. And now they're working with developers to help make sure that affordable housing is being built, not only market rate, and trying to keep things more affordable. Now, if you read anything about Denver, you realize the housing prices are going through the roof right now. Very strong magnet. And this is La Crosse, Wisconsin's transit-oriented development. They, for economic development reasons for their downtown, they built a transit transfer center downtown to try to spur some new development. And basically this bus can pull in the middle of the building. There are 6 bus bays to serve local transit as well as intercity transit. Retail wraps around with, I think, 62 units of housing on top, both market rate and affordable housing. So it really, again, this type of development can be applied at different scales. It's really figuring out what level of intensity makes sense for your community and doing good design to put that into effect. Now, it's not only about the land use side, you have to get the details of the street right as well, and AARP has been promoting the adoption of complete streets policies around the country. Just very quickly, a few years ago, I released a paper, Planning Complete Streets for an Aging America, and we put forth some new designs. Next 2 slides. So this is the, oh, I lost one. Okay, here it is. We offered a number of design solutions that would accommodate all road users. So the Federal Highway Administration has a design guideline out to address the needs of older drivers. And one of the things in their previous version that they recommended were these large turning radii, basically rounded corners, because older drivers tend to overshoot when they make a turn, and that gave them a little bit more space to do that. Now, you know, we, from the planning community, we scratch our heads and think, well, this just encourages all drivers to take that turn much faster, and it puts pedestrians in greater vulnerability. The solution to that is introduce bike lanes. So a lot of times folks in the community think, well, bike lanes, that's just for the bike advocates. No, bike lanes are good for lots and lots of users and purposes. Bike lanes, they provide pedestrians with some shelter from the street. They essentially create that rounded curve for all drivers through an effective curb radius. But the visual impact of that is that it slows people down because they feel like they're driving in a different kind of environment. So we offer a number of these types of recommendations for how you can balance those kind of street design decisions. So I think with that, I will end there. I'd just like to mention that The decisions that we make in planning our communities, designing them, investing in services, they make a huge difference. They make a huge difference on our quality of life and the economic potential of the community, viability of the community, as well as the health of the individuals living there. I started my presentation last night with a story about my mother, who, after my stepfather died, desired to downsize. She lives in a college town, and housing is quite expensive, and she was having an impossible time finding housing that she could downsize in that was basically one-story living that she could afford. There's lots of multifamily housing in a college town, but it's for students, and she abhorred the idea of being close to keg parties. So, these are the kind of challenges that my mother she does not have a disability. However, in some ways, as she ages, not being able to find appropriate housing could actually disable her. It could set her into a situation that where she may have to go into institutional living or something else. Now, the positive side of this story is there's one single condo development that was built in the 70s. It's aged and it's still affordable. She found a property there and has moved in. And so she was able to downsize at a level that was affordable to her. But again, I just want to underscore that our communities can really enable us or they can disable us. And it's up to the design and what we choose as communities to really ensure that we're taking the necessary steps to put in place all of those things that help everyone in the community live their best lives possible. So thank you.
I suspect there may be a question or two here, so I will open it up for questions.
I always ask this because we live in the quintessential suburbs. So how do we translate a lot of this where bus transportation for us, if we were way out of the city of Knoxville, it would not serve a purpose that, in fact, we had bus service and we canceled it because no one was using it. So how do you translate this to suburbs?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I say start with looking at existing retail, like shopping malls. Are there opportunities for redevelopment as the demand for that type of retail changes? And those tend to be sites where you're not disturbing the existing real neighborhoods, but it's the opportunity. Can you start creating some of these nodes of a little higher density that have that sense of destination to bring people to the design of a town center? And if you get enough of those around a region, then you can start connecting those with an appropriate level of public transportation services. I think there was a presentation this morning at the TPO for a development near the airport that in many ways resembled this type of development. It's evolving. There were still suburban elements to it, but it was more urban and it could form one of those backbone nodes. The other thing I would say in another presentation I love to give is the future of transportation, and I alluded to this, that there's incredible disruption right now in this sector. It's a very exciting time, but it's a time for some optimism as well as some caution. The optimism is technologies are there that what we've tried to do for decades in terms of coordinating human services transportation with public transportation services, that can be done if we get the institutional folks to collaborate and share. So I'll be releasing a paper very soon that I call Universal Mobility as a Service, pulling this technology together and making sure we offer a seamless system for everyone in the community to access different transportation services. Because a lot of times the community has mobility options, but folks don't know about it. It's hard to access because it's like pieced into different departments and they have very little money for marketing, et cetera.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question.
I just want to follow up on the question and the comment. You know, many of our suburbs do not have transit, but it does not mean, as Darren was referring to, is your development. It's not transit-oriented development. I like to try to refer to it as people-oriented development. You're developing that place where you can either bike to it or walk to it. It's not where it's from the street, you got 150 yards of parking and then a building. Converting those to people-oriented development. And, you know, then focus around that you then can walk to Village Green, or you can take the Greenway from there to my grandchildren live there. So I think we need to focus on people-oriented development, not and let transportation modes help us serve that. And recognizing long-term that transit may be 20 years out the road, but biking and walking can happen much quicker.
And just to that point, Bloomington, Indiana, and even Atlanta, their Beltline project, while it does have a light rail plan, they're also doing a lot of this kind of development around multi-use trails. And Bloomington is a small town that's doing some similar stuff along a bike trail. So, good stuff.
Let's thank Jana one more time. Thank you all so much for coming. I think she will be around for a few moments. Ask her questions individually. But thank you all for coming.